They put me on the stand and told the judge I didn't know what year it was. They said I'd forgotten my own address. They said I called my dead wife's name into the phone at 3 a.m. None of it was true. I sat there and let every word land. I let Bryce Duval talk himself hoarse. I let my own daughter look at the floor. Then I nodded, once, to the woman sitting beside me. She stood up. She slid one folder across the clerk's desk. The judge read a single date out loud. The room went quiet in a way I'd only heard once before, on a boat, right before something breaks, and that was before anyone found out what the doctor's real schedule looked like. But before the folder, there was the funeral. My name is Harlan Speck. I am 72 years old. I did not raise my voice in that courtroom. I didn't need to. The court officer called my name before I'd even set my coffee down. Bryce Duval was already standing. He was telling the judge I didn't know what year it was. That's actually where this story ends. I want to take you back to where it started. None of it makes sense without the water. I spent 41 years keeping engines alive on the Carolina coast. Mostly diesel, mostly stubborn. Mostly older than the men running them. Shrimp trawlers first. Then a stretch with the Coast Guard cutters out of Beaufort. Then back to my own dock in Menhaden Creek, where I built a tide yard from one leased slip and a used compressor. My wife Corinne did the books. She could read a ledger the way I could read an engine. By ear, by feel, by the small wrongness in a number that didn't sit right. 43 years married. 3 years since she's been gone. I can still rebuild an injector pump blind. I mean that. Eyes closed. Hands in the dark housing of a docked trawler. Feeling for the seat, feeling for the wear. I showed my grandson Milo that trick on a Tuesday. Timed myself against his phone. 4 minutes, 11 seconds. He whooped like I'd won something. I hadn't won anything yet. That comes later. Corinne passed on a quiet Thursday in March 3 years back. I won't dwell on it. She went the way she wanted. At home, with her hand in mine. I promised her 2 things at the hospice window the week before. I promised I'd keep the tide yard running the way she liked the books kept, honest to the penny. And I promised I wouldn't let anybody talk me out of what was mine while I still had the sense to hold it. I didn't know yet how soon that second promise would get tested. My daughter Renee married Bryce Duval 9 years ago, in a tent behind this very tide yard. The marsh grass was gold behind her. Corinne cried into a paper napkin because she said the tide smelled like a blessing. Bryce sold boats, good with people, better with numbers that made him look good, worse with numbers that told the truth. I liked him fine at the wedding. I liked him less every year after. Small ways. Nothing I could have named yet. At Corinne's funeral, Bryce stood by the casket in a suit that cost more than my first truck. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "We need to start simplifying things for you, Dad. Not I'm sorry for your loss. Not one word about Corinne. Simplifying things for me." I said thank you, because that's what you say at a funeral. I filed it where I file things that matter. The back of my head where nothing gets thrown away. Within a month, Renee was coming by twice a week to help me sort mail. She started taking it to her own house instead. Said it was easier. Said she'd bring back anything important. I noticed 6 weeks in that I hadn't seen a bank statement the whole stretch. I didn't say anything. I had the bank mail a duplicate to a post office box Corinne and I had kept for 30 years. One Renee didn't know about. Most of our people didn't know about it either. Habits like that, you don't break just because your wife's gone. You keep them because she'd have wanted you sharp. Bryce started in on the tide yard property that same spring. Said the market was good. Said waterfront wouldn't hold this value forever. Not with the insurance rates the way they were going. Said I should think about selling before the market turned bad on me. I told him the market had turned bad on me exactly twice. In 40 years. I'd outlasted both times by doing nothing. He laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't made a joke. I want to tell you something about the ground under a boat dock. Most people think it's the water that matters. It isn't. It's what's poured underneath. The pilings driven down to bedrock, or driven down to nothing. You can build the prettiest deck in the county on pilings that are rotten 12 feet under the waterline. It'll hold fine, right up until the day it doesn't. I've pulled up docks that looked flawless from the top, found the whole substructure gone soft as bread underneath. That's the thing about load. You don't see what's failing until the day the weight finally finds it. I mention that because I started to feel it under my own feet that spring. Small things. Renee mentioning, almost offhand, that I'd told her a story twice in one visit. I hadn't. I remembered both times clearly. They weren't the same story. They were two different stories about two different repairs at the yard. She'd folded them together somehow, on purpose or by accident. I still don't know which. Then she repeated the folded version back to me like I was the one confused. Bryce brought up a doctor. Said he knew a good one. Said it'd be smart for a man my age to get a baseline. Just routine, nothing to worry about. I said I saw Doc Ellery every 6 months. Had for 20 years. Bryce said Doc Ellery was getting up there himself. Maybe I should see someone fresher. I let it go. I filed it. Here's the thing nobody in that family knew yet. 2 years before any of this, before Corinne was even gone 6 months, I sat down with a lawyer named Faye Odom. Her office was on Pamlico Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse. I built something there. I'm not going to tell you what it was yet. I'll tell you it had Corinne's name on it. It had my grandson Milo's name on it. It did not have Bryce Duval's name on it anywhere, on any page. The ground under Duval's plans wasn't his to sell. Hadn't been for 2 years. He had no earthly idea. I found the reason for that, the real reason, by accident. A Saturday in June. Walking the marina the way I do most mornings, coffee in hand, checking lines out of habit even on boats that aren't mine anymore. I saw a flatbed at Duval Marine Sales, a repossession notice, zip tied to the trailer hitch. A 31-foot centre console Bryce had been bragging about moving for top dollar 2 months earlier. I stood there a minute. I didn't ask questions. A man who spent 40 years around boatyards learns to read a repo notice the way you read a crack in a hull. Quick, quiet. You keep walking like you didn't see it. Seeing it and saying so are two different things. Only one of them gets you anywhere. I went home and called Faye Odom that same afternoon. Not because I panicked. I don't panic. I called because a man doesn't wait for the water to reach his knees before he checks the bilge pump. I asked her one question. Is everything we built still airtight? She told me it was. She told me it had been airtight since the day we signed it. Unless somebody found the filing at the county recorder's office and read it closely, and nobody had any reason to do that unless they were looking, nobody in my family knew a thing. Here's the truth of it. I did not build that protection because I hated my daughter. I built it because Corinne, 6 months before she died, sitting up in bed with the ledger on her lap, out of pure stubborn habit, looked at me over her reading glasses. She said one sentence I never forgot. Watch what he counts before it's his. She meant Bryce. She'd been watching him for years, quiet the way she watched everything. She saw something in him long before I let myself see it. I wrote that sentence in the margin of her own ledger, in pencil, the night she said it. I never told a living soul until much later. That summer the small indignities kept coming, one at a time, spaced out just enough that no single one looked like a pattern. Not if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. Renee stopped by one afternoon, mentioned, casual as weather, that Bryce had shown the property to a man from Wilmington who did waterfront development. My property, my tide yard, 41 years of pilings and compressors, and Corinne's ledgers, shown to a stranger like it was already listed. I asked Renee straight out whose property she meant. She said, ours, Dad. Eventually, not cruel, just certain. That's the part that stayed with me longest, not the greed, the certainty. She'd already decided how the story ended. I didn't argue with her. I have never once raised my voice at my daughter. Not that day, not any day since. I said, is that right? The way I'd say it to a mechanic quoting me a price I already knew was wrong. I let her keep talking. A man who's still talking is a man still giving you information. By August, Bryce had a doctor lined up. Not Doc Ellery. A travelling physician who did house calls for a fee. The kind of doctor who covers 3 counties and remembers faces by the folder, not the face. Bryce told me it was just a checkup. Told me it was covered. Told me it'd take 20 minutes. I let him schedule it. I want you to remember that I let him schedule it. A man who refuses looks like a man with something to hide. I had nothing to hide. I had everything to protect. That's a different thing entirely. The appointment lasted 11 minutes. I timed it, the way I time everything. 11 minutes for a man to decide the state of another man's mind after 72 years of living in it. He asked me what day it was. I told him. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I did it faster than he expected. I watched something cross his face that looked less like relief and more like inconvenience. He left. Bryce thanked him at the door like they were old friends. I didn't think much more about it that week. I had a tide yard to run, a grandson who wanted to learn the injector trick, a garden Corinne had planted along the fence line that still needed tending, whether she was here to see it bloom or not. I want to tell you about that garden. It matters later. She planted it the spring before she got sick. Mostly hydrangeas and a climbing rose she babied for 2 years before it finally took to the trellis. I kept it up every week after she was gone. Not because I'm a gardener. I am not. It was the last thing her hands had shaped. Some promises you keep with a trowel instead of words. Come September, the folder Bryce had been building started to show its edges. Renee mentioned, again casual, that some paperwork had come through about my situation. I asked what situation. She said gently, the way you'd explain something to a child, that the family was just being careful, that nobody wanted to see me lose the yard to a bad decision, that this was about protecting me. I looked at my daughter. I thought about her mother's handwriting in the margin of that ledger. I thought about the flatbed with the repo notice zip-tied to the hitch. I thought about 11 minutes with a doctor who covered 3 counties. I said the only thing I said that whole conversation. I appreciate the concern. Then I finished my coffee. I went out to check the pump on slip 4. It had been running rough all week. Some things you fix with your hands while your head does the rest of the work in the background. Quiet, the way it's always worked best for me. That's where I'll stop for now. At the pump on the slip 4. Coffee gone cold. Bryce's paperwork somewhere moving through channels I hadn't seen yet. And a folder of my own, sitting in a locked filing cabinet in Faye Odom's office, that not one of them knew existed. 2 years old, airtight, waiting. October brought the first real number. Renee sat me down at my own kitchen table. The one Corinne and I bought second-hand in 1986 for $40 from a widow 2 towns over. She told me the tide yard was appraised, informally, at $1,100,000. I asked who'd done the appraising. She said Bryce knew someone. I asked when this someone had walked my property. Nobody had walked my property. Renee didn't have an answer for that. For the first time all year, I watched her realise, just for a second, that she'd repeated something she hadn't checked. I let the second pass. Then I said, easy as anything, that the yard, the house, the equipment and the savings Corinne and I built came to right around $2,400,000 all told. Renee's eyes did a thing eyes do when a number lands bigger than expected. Bryce had clearly told her a smaller figure. Bryce had clearly been doing his own math on what he thought he was owed. It wasn't matching mine. That gap between his number and my number told me more than any document could have. I want to walk you through what I actually had. It matters for what comes later. The tide yard property itself, the land and the buildings, and the 2 working docks, worth about $950,000 by the county's own last assessment. The equipment inside it, the lift, the compressors, the tools I'd collected over 4 decades, insured for $110,000. The house Corinne and I lived in for 38 years, paid off free and clear, worth around $340,000 on today's market. Savings and a modest portfolio, one Faye Odom had helped Corinne and me structure conservatively over the years, sitting at just under $600,000. And a life insurance payout from Corinne's policy, $80,000, that I never touched. It sat in an account by itself. Spending it felt like spending her. Add it up and you get somewhere past $2 million. All of it built from engines and ledgers, and 41 years of getting up before the sun. None of it came from luck. None of it came from anybody's family money. Corinne's father was a shrimper who died broke and proud. Mine ran a hardware store that failed twice before it finally held. We built what we had from a leased slip and a used compressor, one contract at a time. Every dollar of it I can still tell you where it came from. Bryce, meanwhile, was carrying debt I wouldn't learn the full shape of for another month. His brokerage, Duval Marine Sales, had taken out a loan of $320,000 to buy 3 vessels he intended to flip fast. 2 of them hadn't sold. The bank wanted its money by spring. Bryce didn't have it. A man who doesn't have $320,000 starts looking hard at anyone who has $2 million. I didn't know the exact figure yet, not in October. I knew the shape of it. The way you know a bearing's going before it screams, from the small vibration under your palm. I called Faye again. I asked her to quietly confirm the trust filing was still clean at the recorder's office. She confirmed it within the hour. 2 years old. Notarized. Witnessed by Doc Ellery himself as a competency witness at signing. Filed properly. Untouched. I should tell you what that filing actually was. I've been holding it back on purpose, the same way I held it back from my own family for 2 years. It was an irrevocable trust. The Corinne Speck Family Trust, named for my wife, because it was her warning that started it and her memory it was meant to protect. The tide yard, the house, and the bulk of the savings had all been moved into it. I remained the trustee and the income beneficiary for my lifetime. Nothing changed day to day. I still ran the yard, still lived in the house, still spent as I always had. But the ownership itself, the part that mattered in a courtroom, sat inside that trust, locked to a distribution plan naming my grandson Milo as the ultimate beneficiary. Faye Odom as successor trustee, if anything ever happened to me. Bryce Duval's name appeared nowhere. Renee's name appeared only as Milo's mother, with no control of her own. I signed it on a Tuesday morning in Faye's office, 2 years before any of this started. Doc Ellery sat in as a witness, specifically so nobody could ever say later that my mind wasn't sound the day I did it. Faye had suggested that herself. She said, "Harlan, people like the Duvals of the world always come back around eventually. When they do, you want a doctor's signature dated years before they ever thought to question yours." I didn't fully believe her at the time. I believed her completely by October. November brought the second doctor, not the travelling man from August. A different one this time. A specialist Bryce found through, of all things, a flyer at the pharmacy, offering cognitive wellness evaluations for seniors, $400 a visit, no insurance accepted. Bryce offered to pay for it himself. That should have told Renee something. A man that broke, offering to spend $400 easily. I went along with that one too. I sat through another 20 minutes of questions. I answered every one of them plainly and correctly. I watched the doctor write something down I couldn't see. I thought about Corinne's handwriting in the ledger margin. Watch what he counts before it's his. I thought not yet, but soon. By Thanksgiving, the shape of the plan was clear enough that I stopped pretending, even to myself, that this was a misunderstanding. Renee brought up, over turkey, in front of Milo, that some people in Dad's situation benefit from having a co-decision maker on financial matters, just to share the load. Bryce nodded along like a man agreeing with weather. Milo, 12 years old, looked at me across the table with a face that said he didn't understand what was happening, but knew enough to be scared by it. I said, calm as I've ever said anything, "I've been sharing the load my whole life, Renee. 41 years of it. I don't recall asking anybody to help carry it now." Nobody answered that. Bryce refilled his wine. Renee looked at her plate. Milo asked if he could be excused. I told him, "Yes, son, go on." I watched him leave the table faster than a boy leaves the table he actually wants to stay at. That night, after they'd gone, I sat in the workshop with the light off except for the one bulb over the bench. I opened the steel toolbox Corinne's father had welded shut decades ago, for a completely different reason. Back when he didn't trust banks after the shrimp co-op failed in the 70s. I'd repurposed it years back. Inside it wasn't tools anymore. It was Corinne's original ledgers, going back to the year we opened. A duplicate copy of the trust documents Faye had given me for exactly this kind of night. And the pencil note I'd copied out of the ledger margin onto a fresh index card, so I wouldn't lose it in the original book. Watch what he counts before it's his. I read it twice by that one bulb, closed the box and went to bed. December, I learned what Renee had actually been telling people. At church. At the market. Wherever gossip travels in a town the size of Menhaden Creek. That her father had good days and bad days. That the family was handling it delicately. That nobody wanted to embarrass me by making it public. But everyone should understand if I seemed a little different lately. I heard this second-hand from Doc Ellery himself. He called me on a Sunday evening, sounding more angry than I'd heard him in 20 years of appointments. "Harlan," he said, "somebody told my receptionist you'd had a small stroke nobody mentioned to me. I've seen you every 6 months for 2 decades. There has been no stroke. Somebody is lying about you, and I would very much like to know why." I told him I had a fair idea why. I told him I might need him to say exactly that. In exactly those words, at some point down the road. He said he'd say it anywhere, anytime, under oath if it came to that. I thanked him. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet kitchen a long while, looking at the chair Corinne used to sit in. I said out loud to nobody, to the empty chair, "I'm not going to let them, Corinne." It's the only time in this whole story I said anything out loud to a room with no one in it. I'm not ashamed of it. A man's allowed one conversation with a chair if the woman who used to sit in it built half of what he's protecting. January is when the petition got filed. Faye called me herself. These things moved through the courthouse, and she still had eyes there. 30 years of practicing law, 2 blocks from where I was building my own defence. Bryce and Renee had filed for a guardianship hearing, citing documented cognitive decline and 2 evaluations. The travelling doctor from August, the pharmacy flyer specialist from November, both suggesting, in careful hedge language, that I may benefit from assistance with complex financial decisions. Neither evaluation used the word incompetent. Neither one had to. A judge reads may benefit from assistance, and here's exactly what it's designed to make her hear. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of March, 10 weeks out. Faye asked me how I wanted to handle it, whether I wanted her to file aggressively beforehand, put everything on the table early, end it before it started. I told her no. I told her I wanted to let Bryce Duval stand up in open court and say every word he'd been rehearsing for a year. In front of a judge, in front of my daughter, in front of anyone else who wandered into that courtroom that morning. A lie told quietly in a kitchen is one thing. A lie told out loud under oath is a different animal entirely. I wanted his on the record before I ever opened my folder. "You want him to finish the sentence," Faye said. "I want him to finish the sentence," I said, "and then I want to read him the next one. 10 weeks. I spent them the way I've spent most of my life, working with my hands during the day, letting my head work quietly behind it, checking pumps, tending the garden Corinne planted, teaching Milo the injector trick until he could do it in 3 minutes flat on his own, faster than I'd managed it most Tuesdays. I didn't confront Renee again. I didn't confront Bryce at all. I let them build their case in full view. I let Faye Odom build hers in the dark. Somewhere in that 10 weeks, I stopped feeling like a man defending himself and started feeling like a man who'd already won, simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the fact of it. Late January, I found something I wasn't looking for. That's usually how the important things turn up. I'd gone into the cedar chest at the foot of our bed to find Corinne's good wool coat. The ladies' auxiliary at church was collecting winter clothes. I thought she'd have wanted hers to go to somebody who needed the warmth more than a closet needed the memory. Under the coat, folded inside a paper sleeve she'd clearly prepared on purpose, was an envelope with my name on it in her handwriting. Just Harlan on the front, nothing else. I sat on the edge of the bed a long time before I opened it. My hands don't shake. Not from age, not from work. 41 years of holding a wrench steady taught them not to. They shook opening that envelope. Inside was a letter. 4 pages, dated 8 months before she died. She must have written it not long after the day she said the sentence in the ledger margin. The letter started right where that sentence left off, like she'd been carrying the rest of the thought around, and finally sat down to finish it. "Harlan," it began, "if you're reading this, I've been gone a while and you've probably already caught Bryce doing something that made your jaw tighten the way it does. I want you to know I saw it coming before you did. I've been keeping his books in my head the same way I keep ours. A man who spends like he's already rich and isn't yet, that man gets desperate on a schedule you can set a clock to." She went on. She told me she'd watched Bryce over the years, quote, inflated numbers to Renee about what he was worth. Watched him buy things slightly beyond what the brokerage could actually support. Watched him get quietly evasive anytime money came up at family gatherings. The way a man gets evasive when he's covering for something. She said she never told me outright while she was alive. She didn't want to poison the last years we had with our daughter over a suspicion she couldn't prove yet. But she asked me, in that letter, to do one thing for her. Protect what we built, Harlan. The way you'd protect a hull below the waterline. Not loud. Not a fight at the dinner table. Just make sure that whatever Bryce Duval is running toward, he doesn't drag our daughter and our grandson into the wreck with him. And when the day comes that he comes for what's ours, and it will come, don't raise your voice. You never have. Just show him the deed. Let the paper do what your temper never needed to. At the bottom, under her signature, one more line. Added it looked like at a different sitting. The ink a shade darker. I love you. Water the roses even when you don't feel like it, and watch what he counts before it's his. I read that letter 3 times that night. I put it back in its paper sleeve. I put the sleeve in the steel toolbox, with the ledgers and the trust copy, because it belonged with the rest of the evidence now, not just the memory. Corinne had built half my defence from the grave, in her own hand, dated years before Bryce ever filed a single paper against me. I want you to sit with that a moment. It's the piece of this story I still can't say out loud without my throat doing something I don't love it doing. My wife protected me after she was gone, the same way she protected me while she was here. Quietly, on paper, airtight. I told Faye about the letter the next morning. She asked if I wanted to introduce it at the hearing. I said not unless we needed it. Some things you keep in reserve, the way you keep a spare pump you hope you never have to use, but you're glad it's there. February brought the rehook, the thing that changed what I thought this whole fight was actually about. I'd assumed, up to that point, that Bryce wanted the Tide Yard property itself, the land, because land is the kind of asset a broke man can borrow against fast. I learned otherwise through an offhand comment from a marina regular named Chester Voss, who does title searches for a living. He mentioned it over coffee. Bryce had already approached a bank about using anticipated inheritance as collateral for a bridge loan to cover his $320,000 debt. Anticipated inheritance, meaning Bryce hadn't just been angling to eventually inherit the property through Renee someday. He'd been trying to borrow against it right now, this spring, before the guardianship was even granted, betting the bank would trust a son-in-law's confidence more than they should have. That told me something I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't a slow, patient, long game. Bryce was drowning faster than I'd realised. The guardianship hearing wasn't the beginning of his plan. It was the last card in a hand he'd already mostly lost. If the hearing failed, or even if it just took too long, the bank would come for him regardless, publicly, before spring was out. He needed the guardianship, not eventually. He needed it now, this month, to show the bank collateral that didn't actually belong to him yet. I called Faye with that piece of information. She went quiet on the phone, in the particular way she goes quiet when a case has just gotten easier. "That changes the timing," she said. "That's not a man being patient. That's a man who's going to make a mistake soon because he doesn't have the luxury of being careful." She was right. In late February, 3 weeks before the hearing, Bryce made his mistake. He showed up at my Tide Yard, alone on a Saturday morning. He asked to walk the property for insurance purposes, he said. Though I hadn't asked for any new insurance, and he had no authority to request one either, I let him walk it. I walked it with him, actually. A man doesn't let a stranger, even a son-in-law, wander his own land unsupervised. Somewhere by the second dock he mentioned, casual as he thought it sounded, that once everything got sorted out in March, he'd probably bring in the Wilmington developer to talk seriously about the West parcel. I said, "That's so." He said, "Figured you want to know the direction things are heading, Dad." No surprises. I looked at him a long moment. I thought about the flatbed with the repo notice. I thought about 11 minutes with a doctor who covers 3 counties. I thought about my wife's letter in the steel toolbox, not 60 feet from where we stood. I said the only thing I said that whole conversation, the same 5 words I'd used on Renee back in September. Some sentences do their best work used twice. I appreciate the concern. He smiled like he'd won something. He hadn't won anything. I want you to remember that smile. I'll come back to it. That same week, I sat Milo down in the workshop. Just the 2 of us. I told him something I'd been putting off telling him for months. A boy that age shouldn't have to carry adult weight before he's ready. But I judged rightly, I believe, that he was ready enough to carry a small piece of it. I told him that whatever he heard people saying about me in the coming weeks, whatever his mother or his father said at the dinner table, or in the car on the way home, none of it was true. Someday soon he'd understand exactly why. Until then, all I needed from him was to keep doing the injector trick, until he could do it faster than me. He asked if I was going to be okay. I told him I'd been okay for 72 years, and I didn't plan on stopping now. He hugged me the way boys that age hug, quick, a little embarrassed. He went back to the trawler engine to practice. I stood there in the doorway a minute longer than I needed to, watching him work, thinking about how much of Corin was in the careful way he handled a tool he didn't fully understand yet. The hearing was 2 weeks out. Faye had everything indexed. The trust, dated and notarized 2 years prior. Doc Ellery's original witness statement from the signing, Doc Ellery's phone call, which he'd had him put in writing, describing the false stroke rumour, Chester Voss's records confirming the collateral inquiry Bryce had made at the bank, and, quietly subpoenaed that same week, the travelling doctor's actual appointment log, the one Bryce never imagined anyone would think to request. It showed the evaluation Bryce kept citing had lasted exactly one visit, 11 minutes long, not the ongoing course of assessment his petition implied. One folder, everything indexed, tabbed, and ready, sitting in a locked filing cabinet on Pamlico Street, 3 blocks from a courtroom where, in 14 days, Bryce Duval was going to stand up and tell a judge that I didn't know what year it was. I slept fine those 2 weeks. I want that understood, because people expect a man in my position to lie awake sweating. I did not lie awake. I fixed a transmission for a neighbour who couldn't pay full price, and I didn't charge him full price. I watered Corinne's roses, even though it was too early in the season for them to need it, because she'd asked me to. And some habits you keep whether the plant needs it or not. I taught my grandson to find an injector seat blind in under 3 minutes. And every night before bed, I opened the steel toolbox, just to look, just to be sure the folder that mattered most, the paper sleeve with Corinne's handwriting on it, was still exactly where I'd left it. It always was. She'd made sure of that a long time before I ever needed it. 1 week before the hearing, Renee invited me to Sunday dinner. Just the 3 of them, and me. No extended family. No church friends dropping by after. I almost didn't go. I went anyway. A man who stops showing up to his own daughter's table before the fight even starts has already told the room he's afraid. I wasn't afraid. I was patient. Those look similar from across a table. They are not the same thing. Renee made pot roast, the recipe Corinne taught her 30 years ago. For a moment, just a moment, sitting at that table with the smell of it filling the kitchen the way it used to fill our own kitchen on Sundays, I let myself remember that this was still my daughter. Not just a name on a petition. This story isn't clean the way revenge stories sometimes get told. I loved her the whole time. I still do. That's exactly why what happened next cut the way it did. Bryce was in an expansive mood. Wine before dinner, a second glass during. Talking too easily about the future. About how, once things were settled, he had ideas for the Tide Yard property. A small marina expansion, slips for pleasure boats instead of just working trawlers. Modernising the whole operation. He talked like a man who already owned the place. I let him talk. I asked him a few questions, the way you'd ask a man about his plans when you already know the ending of the story, and he doesn't. What's the expansion run, cost-wise? I asked. Easy, curious, the voice I use asking a supplier about lead times. He said somewhere around $400,000. He had financing lined up. I thought about the $320,000 he already owed the bank. I thought, there it is. There's the whole shape of the man, borrowing against a property he doesn't own yet, to fund an expansion he can't afford, on top of debt he already can't pay. I didn't say any of that. I said, sounds ambitious. He took it as a compliment. A drowning man mistakes any hand near him for a rescue. Renee asked, at one point almost gently, whether I'd thought more about the arrangement, meaning the guardianship, meaning handing over the very control of my own life to the 2 people across the table from me. I set my fork down. I did not raise my voice. I said, I've thought about it plenty, Renee. I think about it every morning when I get up and every night before I go to sleep. I think you should let the judge hear all of it next week. Every bit. And then we'll all know a lot more than we know tonight. Bryce laughed. A short laugh. The kind a man laughs when he's nervous and trying to cover it with confidence. Nothing to worry about, Dad, he said. It's just a formality at this point. I looked at him and said, quiet. Formalities have a way of surprising people who don't read the whole page. Nobody at that table understood what I meant, except me. That's usually how it works. Right up until the moment it isn't. Milo, sitting beside me, asked to be excused early again. This time I asked to walk him out to the porch with him. Renee let us go without comment. On the porch in the cold March evening, my grandson looked up at me. He asked, quiet enough that his parents couldn't hear through the screen door, whether the hearing next week meant I was going away somewhere. I told him no. I told him the hearing meant some grown-up business was going to get settled, that he shouldn't worry about it. That no matter what he heard people say in that courtroom, he should remember one thing, and only one thing, that his grandmother built half of everything he'd ever inherit, with her own two hands and her own sharp head for numbers, that nobody, not a judge, not his father, not anybody, was going to erase that from the record. He didn't fully understand. He nodded anyway, the way kids do when they trust the tone more than the words. I drove home that night past the marina, past Duval Marine Sales, dark, closed, a for sale by owner sign, leaning against the fence that I hadn't noticed before. Cardboard, hand-lettered, the kind of sign a man puts up himself when he can't afford to list properly with an agent. I slowed down enough to read it clearly. Bryce was trying to sell his own commercial building, on top of everything else, quietly, before the bank could seize it first. He hadn't told Renee. I'd have bet the whole tide yard on that. I called Faye first thing Monday morning and told her what I'd seen. She said it didn't change the plan, but it confirmed the timeline. He's not circling anymore, Harlan, she said. He's in the spin now. A week out. This is exactly when a desperate man overplays his hand in court. He doesn't have the patience left to play it carefully. She was more right than either of us knew yet. Tuesday, 4 days before the hearing, I got a call from Doc Ellery, agitated in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him in 20 years. He said the state medical board had reached out to him, informally, asking about a complaint filed against a travelling physician from August, the one who'd done the 11-minute evaluation. Apparently, I wasn't the only elderly patient in the region that doctor had rushed through in a similarly hollow appointment. At least one other family had already filed a formal grievance months before mine ever came up. Doc Ellery said the board wanted to know if I'd be willing to give a statement. I told him I'd give more than a statement. I'd give them the whole folder if it came to that. A man who does this to me has almost certainly done it to somebody with far less protection built around them than I had. That thought bothered me more than anything Bryce had done directly to me. Bryce wanted my money. This travelling doctor was apparently in the business of manufacturing the paperwork for men like Bryce all across 3 counties. That's a different, colder kind of wrong. A wrong done to people who don't have a Faye Odom and a steel toolbox and a wife who wrote a letter from beyond her own grave. Wednesday, 3 days out, Renee called me, alone this time. No Bryce on the line. She sounded different, smaller. She asked if we could talk, just the two of us. I said of course. She came by that evening without Milo, without Bryce, and sat at my kitchen table, where she'd sat 1,000 times as a girl doing her homework while Corinne cooked. Dad, she said, I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth. I've never told you anything else, I said. Are you okay? Really okay? Not what Bryce says, not what the doctors said. You. Tell me the truth. I looked at my daughter a long moment. I thought about every unfair thing I could have said in that moment. Every accusation I'd been quietly stacking for a year. I set all of it down. The way you set down a heavy tool when your hand finally needs the rest. I am the same man I've always been, Renee, I said. Sharper, if anything, because I've had to be, watching what's been happening around me this past year. I am not confused. I have never once forgotten your mother's name, or your name, or Milo's name, or a single number in a ledger I've kept my whole life. Somebody has been telling you a story about me that isn't true. I think somewhere under all the noise you already know that. She cried quietly at that kitchen table, the way she used to cry as a girl, when she'd broken something and didn't know how to say sorry yet. She didn't apologise that night. She wasn't ready. But she left something behind when she went home that I didn't expect. On her way out the door, she turned and said, Bryce told me the appraiser walked the property in the fall. I never actually saw him do it. I just believed Bryce. That was the first crack. I didn't push it. A crack needs time to run its length before you can do anything useful with it. I said goodnight. I watched her taillights go down the drive. I went back inside and sat with Corinne's letter one more time before the hearing. I wanted her words fresh in my head for what was coming. 2 days left. Faye called with the final confirmation. The appointment log from the travelling doctor's office had come through the subpoena, exactly as she'd predicted. 1 visit, 11 minutes, no follow-up scheduled, no course of assessment. Despite the petition's repeated claim of ongoing evaluation, she also confirmed something else, almost as an aside, that would matter more than either of us guessed that Friday afternoon. The State Medical Board had opened a formal inquiry into the travelling physician 2 days earlier. By the time of my hearing, there would already be a paper trail suggesting this doctor's evaluations weren't reliable anywhere, for anyone, not just for me. One more thing, Faye said. I did a title search on Duval Marine Sales this morning, out of pure habit. The building's listed for sale by owner has been for 11 days. Nobody's called on it. And the banknote comes due in 19 days. 19 days. The hearing was in 2. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen a long while, looking out the window at Corinne's roses. Not yet blooming, just green and patient, the way they are every March before they remember what month it is. I thought about load-bearing walls again, the way I always come back to that thought when something's about to give. Bryce had built his whole plan on ground that was never his, propped up on a doctor whose license was about to come under review, a banknote he couldn't cover, and a wife who was starting, just barely, to ask her own questions instead of repeating his. I wasn't worried anymore. I hadn't been worried in months, if I'm honest, not since the day Faye confirmed the trust was airtight. But standing at that window 2 days before the hearing, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't quite had before. This wasn't going to be a fight I won. It was going to be a collapse Bryce had already engineered for himself. All I had to do, the only thing left for me to do, was show up, sit quietly, let him say every single word out loud, on the record, before I opened the folder and let the truth catch up to him. I need to back up a little. I skipped past some of the 10 weeks between the petition and the hearing too fast. There's a piece in the middle of it that matters as much as anything I've told you so far. 3 weeks after the petition was filed in late January, before I'd found Corinne's letter in the cedar chest, Renee asked to meet me somewhere that wasn't my house, or hers. She picked a diner off Route 24, the Menharden Grill, a place Corinne and I used to stop after church most Sundays for 30 years, back when the coffee was 50 cents, and the waitress knew our order before we sat down. Renee picked it, I think, without fully realising what she was choosing. Or maybe she realised exactly what she was choosing, and wanted the ground under that conversation to be softer than it would have been anywhere else. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen since Milo was a colicky baby, and she and Bryce were running on no sleep for months. She ordered coffee and didn't touch it. I ordered the same eggs I've ordered at that counter for 4 decades. Dad, she said, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I think you are a bad father, or because I don't love you. I know that, I said. I meant it. Whatever else was true, I never once believed my daughter woke up wanting to hurt me. I believed she'd been fed a story, slowly, one convincing detail at a time. The way you feed a man rope an inch at a time until he doesn't notice he's tied. Bryce says the business is fine, she said, not quite looking at me. He says the loan is normal, that everybody in his business carries debt like that it's just how boats work. I set my fork down. Renee, I said, how much do you actually know about what Bryce owes right now, today, this month? She didn't know a figure. She knew some debt. She knew a business loan. She knew Bryce had assured her repeatedly it was under control. I didn't push her further that morning. I'd learned, over the year, that pushing my daughter only made her defend the story harder, the way a man defends a bad weld louder the more you point at it. I let it sit. What she told me next, though, is the piece I want you to have. It's the first time anyone inside that marriage said something true, out loud to me before the hearing ever happened. She said Bryce had been different the last year, sharper with her over small things, short-tempered about money in a way he'd never been before. She said he'd started sleeping badly, some nights not at all, pacing the kitchen at 2 and 3 in the morning. The same hour, ironically, he'd later claim I was wandering my own garden calling for a dead woman. I think something's wrong with him, she said. Quiet, almost like a confession. I think something's actually wrong, and I think this, all of this, the doctors, the petition, I think it's about him, not you. I just don't want to believe that, because if it's about him, then I did this to you for no reason at all. I want to tell you I felt vindicated hearing that. I didn't, particularly. I felt sad for her. The way you feel sad watching someone realise slowly that the floor they've been standing on for years was never solid. I reached across that diner table and put my hand over hers, the way I used to when she was small and scared of a thunderstorm. I said, Renee, whatever you find out about your husband in the next few weeks, your mother and I love you no less than the day you were born. That has never once been in question. I need you to hear that before anything else happens. She cried a little, right there in the Menharden Grill. The waitress, an older woman named Pearl, who'd been serving that counter since before Renee was born, came by and refilled my coffee without a word. Didn't ask a single question. Small towns run on exactly that kind of decency. The kind that lets people fall apart quietly at a diner counter without an audience. That was the first crack. 3 weeks before Faye ever found the second doctor's appointment log. 3 weeks before the medical board inquiry. 3 weeks before any of the paper evidence existed in a form we could use in court. It was just a daughter, at a diner, admitting she didn't fully believe her own husband anymore. I drove home that day, thinking that whatever happened at the hearing, something in my family had already started to come apart from the inside. On its own, without me lifting a finger. The way a bad weld fails eventually, no matter how carefully you avoid touching it. February, I want to tell you about a Tuesday that didn't make it into the hearing record. It didn't need to, but it mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened that whole stretch. Milo had a school project, a family history assignment, something every 7th grader in the county does apparently. Interview a grandparent about how things used to be. He came by the tide yard after school with a spiral notebook and a list of questions his teacher had printed out. We sat on 2 overturned buckets by the second dock while I answered them. He asked what the hardest part of my job used to be. I told him it wasn't the engines. Engines are honest. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. The hardest part was the years right after we opened, when Corinne and I were living on almost nothing, when a single bad month could have ended the whole thing before it started. I told him about the winter we survived on $1,100 for 3 months, rationing groceries, patching our own roof ourselves because we couldn't afford a contractor, Corinne taking in mending work from 3 other shrimping families, just to keep the lights on, while I chased every repair job on the coast that would pay in cash. He asked what I was proudest of. I told him it wasn't the money, though the money mattered. It was the day, 12 years into the business, when I paid off the loan on this land in full. Walked into the bank with a cashier's check for the last $41,000 I owed. The loan officer, a man who doubted me openly when I first applied, shook my hand and admitted he hadn't thought I'd make it past year 3. Milo wrote all of it down in his careful 12-year-old handwriting. Near the end, he looked up at me and asked, off the assignment sheet entirely, "Grandpa, is it true what Mum said, that you might not be able to run this place much longer?" I looked at my grandson a long moment. I thought about how to answer a boy his age, honestly, without frightening him. I settled on the truth, plain the way Corinne always told me the truth works best delivered. "Some people think that, Milo," I said. "They're wrong. In a few weeks a judge is going to say so out loud. Until then, all I need from you is what I've always needed. Keep showing up. Keep learning the trade. That's the whole inheritance, son. More than any deed or dollar. It's knowing how to build something real with your own 2 hands, and not let anybody talk you out of what you know to be true." He wrote that down too, verbatim, for his school project. Turned it in the following week. His teacher apparently read it out loud to the class as an example of a strong interview. A small thing. But it's the kind of small thing that told me, more than any courtroom victory would, that something in my family was going to survive this intact, whatever else happened. Late February, I mentioned Bryce's Saturday visit to the tide yard, the insurance walk where he let slip his plans for the west parcel. What I didn't tell you is what happened 2 days after that. It belongs here, closer to the hearing, where its weight actually landed. Chester Voss, the title researcher who'd first told me about Bryce's bank inquiry, called me again. This time with something harder. He'd been doing an unrelated title search near the marina. He'd come across a public notice, filed with the county, of a second lien against Duval Marine Sales. This one from a supplier Bryce apparently owed close to $60,000 for parts and equipment never paid for. Combined with the $320,000 bank loan, Bryce's total exposure was closer to $380,000. Against a business that, by every outward appearance, still looked successful enough to host client dinners and buy rounds at the yacht club bar. I sat with that number a long while, $380,000, against my $2,400,000. The gap between what Bryce actually had and what Bryce desperately needed everyone to believe he had was the whole engine driving every single thing that had happened to me in the past year. The funeral comment, the mail, the doctors, the petition. All of it traced back to a hole in one man's finances he could not admit to anyone, least of all his own wife. I called Faye with the new figure. She added it to the file, calm as always. She said something I've thought about often since. "Harlan," she said, The thing about a man drowning in debt he's ashamed of is he'll do almost anything before he'll say the words out loud. Guardianship, false doctors, rumours about a stroke that never happened. All of it is cheaper to him, in his mind, than standing in front of his wife and saying, "I'm $380,000 underwater, and I don't know how to get out." I thought that was about the truest thing anyone said to me the whole 10 weeks. March came in cold the way it does on the Carolina coast some years. Wind off the Sound sharp enough to make the flags outside the courthouse snap instead of wave. 1 week before the hearing, I had dinner with Renee, Bryce, and Milo. The Sunday pot roast dinner I already told you about, the one where Bryce talked about a $400,000 marina expansion he had no earthly way of financing. The one where I drove home afterward past the hand-lettered for sale sign leaning against his own commercial building's fence. I want to add one detail to that night I left out before. After I got home, before I went to bed, I sat down and wrote a short letter of my own. Not to send, just to have. The way Corinne had once written hers. I addressed it to Milo, to be given to him someday. Whenever the right day came, whenever he was old enough to carry the whole weight of this story the way I'd carried it that year. I told him the truth about his father's debts. Gently. Without cruelty. A boy deserves to know the real shape of the people who raised him eventually. On his own terms, in his own time, from someone who loved him enough to tell it straight. I sealed that letter and put it in the steel toolbox next to his grandmother's. 2 generations of Speck family truth-telling, now sitting in the same welded box that had once, decades earlier, held nothing but wrenches and a shrimper's distrust of banks. I thought, closing that lid, that maybe this was the real inheritance in my family. Not the tide yard, not the money. But this habit we had, the women and the men both, of writing the truth down carefully and trusting it to survive longer than any lie told out loud at a dinner table. The hearing was 6 days away. I slept fine. 5 days before the hearing, Faye called me in for what she called a final prep session, though we both knew there wasn't much left to prepare. The evidence was gathered. The exhibits were tabbed. What she wanted really was to walk through the courtroom choreography one more time. 30 years of practicing law had taught her that the difference between a folder that lands and a folder that gets lost in the shuffle is often nothing more than timing. We sat in her office on Pamlico Street, the same office where I'd signed the trust 2 years earlier. She laid the whole file out across her desk one more time. The trust document itself, crisp despite its age, Doc Ellery's careful signature on the witness line. His written statement about the false stroke rumour, typed, notarised, dated the week before. The subpoenaed appointment log from Dr. Okafor's office, 11 minutes circled in red pen by Faye's own hand. The letter from the State Medical Board, confirming the open inquiry. And a fresh page, added just that week, a sworn statement from Chester Voss, detailing both the bank inquiry about anticipated inheritance and the second lien from the unpaid supplier. 4 exhibits, Faye said, plus the cross-examination question. That's it. That's the whole case. I could make it longer, Harlan. I could pile on 10 more pages of corroborating detail and make it look more impressive on paper. But a judge like Constance Reyes doesn't need volume. She needs clarity. 4 clean facts and 1 clean question, and Bryce Duval does the rest of the work for us. A man defending a lie under oath always eventually says more than he means to. I told her I trusted her judgment completely. I meant it, the same way I trust a mechanic who spent 30 years listening to engines and knows exactly which sound means trouble and which sound is just an old machine settling. She asked me, near the end of that session, whether I wanted to say anything myself at the hearing, whether I wanted to testify. I thought about it a long moment. No, I said. I don't think I do. I think the strongest thing I can do in that room is sit there quiet and let every single person watch a man dig his own hole in front of a judge who reads everything. If I get up and defend myself, it becomes my word against his. If I say nothing at all, it becomes his word against the paper. And paper doesn't get nervous. Paper doesn't contradict itself. Paper just sits there being true. Faye smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from her in weeks. That's the smartest legal strategy I've heard from a client who isn't a lawyer in 30 years of practice, she said. Most people can't stand to stay quiet. It feels like losing to them, even when it's the only way to win. I've spent 41 years fixing things that fail because somebody rushed, or somebody talked when they should have listened, I said. This isn't so different. 4 days before the hearing, I drove out to the cemetery where Corinne is buried. A small plot on a hill outside town, with a view, on a clear day, all the way to the Sound. I don't visit as often as people probably think I should. Corinne and I talked about this once, years before she got sick, in one of those conversations you have almost by accident, about what happens after, about graves and memorials and all the rituals the living build around the dead. She told me plainly the way she told me most things, that she didn't need me standing over a stone, talking to a slab of granite. She said if I wanted to talk to her, I should talk to her in the garden, among the roses she'd actually planted with her own hands. That was where she actually was, in the things she'd built and touched and cared for. Far more than in a plot of ground she'd never once seen while she was alive to see anything. But that day, 4 days before the hearing, I went anyway. Some rituals aren't really for the dead, they're for the living. I needed a place to stand still for a few minutes before the last stretch of this fight. I told her out loud, standing on that hill, with the wind coming hard off the Sound, about the trust, about Doc Ellery, about the letter I'd found in the cedar chest, the one she'd written and hidden for me to find, exactly when I needed it most. I told her I'd read it a dozen times by then, and I still heard her voice reading it back to me every time. I told her Milo could do the injector trick in under 3 minutes now, faster than either of us had managed most Tuesdays. I told her Renee was starting, slowly, painfully, to see something true about the man she'd married, that whatever happened at the hearing, I thought our daughter was going to be all right eventually, because she came from good stubborn stock on both sides. I didn't cry standing there, not because I don't. I have, plenty in the 3 years since she's been gone. But that day I felt something closer to gratitude than grief. She'd protected me from the grave, the same way she'd protected me her whole life. Quietly, on paper, in a ledger margin, in a letter sealed in a paper sleeve under a wool coat. I thanked her for that, out loud on a windy hill. Then I drove home and watered the roses, even though they didn't need it yet, because some promises you keep on a schedule of your own choosing, not the plants. 3 days before the hearing, the last piece of preparation came together. Though I didn't fully understand its weight until Faye explained it to me over the phone that evening. The State Medical Board, moving faster than either of us expected, had sent Faye a formal letter. It confirmed not just an open inquiry into Dr. Okafor, but a preliminary finding, pending final review, that his evaluation practices across multiple counties failed to meet the board's minimum standard of care. It wasn't final. It wasn't a revoked license yet. But it was official, on state letterhead, dated 2 days before my hearing. By the time Bryce's attorney stood up to defend his petition, the very evaluation underpinning it had already been flagged, independently, by the body responsible for licensing doctors in that state. "This isn't just about you anymore, Harlan," Faye said. "This is a pattern. You happen to be the one with the resources and the family history to fight back properly. I suspect there are other families out there who didn't have a Corinne Speck writing letters from beyond the grave, who didn't have a Doc Ellery willing to go to bat, who just quietly lost control of their own lives to this exact playbook, because nobody caught it in time." That thought sat with me heavier than almost anything else in this whole story. I want to say, plainly here, that whatever satisfaction I felt watching my own case fall into place, it was matched, maybe even outweighed by a colder anger. The idea that Bryce hadn't invented this scheme himself, that he'd simply found a doctor already running it on other frightened families, other confused adult children, other elderly people without the particular luck I'd had. I told Faye I wanted my case, whatever happened with it, connected formally to the board's broader inquiry, on the record, so that whatever came of my hearing might also help close the door on Dr. Okafor doing this to anyone else. She said she'd already made sure of that. Of course she had. 30 years on Pamlico Street teaches a woman to think 2 steps past the client sitting in front of her. 2 days before the hearing, I saw Bryce one last time before the courtroom. By accident. At the hardware store on Route 24, where I've bought lumber and fittings for 4 decades. He was buying a lockbox, the kind people use for important documents. He looked, for the first time since Corinne's funeral, genuinely rattled. Dark circles under his eyes, his hands moving too fast at the register. He saw me across the store. For a moment, something flickered across his face that looked almost like he wanted to say something honest. He didn't. He nodded, the same small nod from the Tide Yard walk, and left without a word. I stood there a moment longer, looking at the space where he'd been standing. I thought about Renee's words at the diner weeks earlier. I think something's actually wrong with him. For one brief moment, I felt something almost like pity for the man, drowning in a debt he was too proud to admit to anyone, building an elaborate lie instead of simply telling his wife the truth and asking for help the honest way. Pity doesn't change what a man does, though. It only changes how you feel watching the consequences land. I drove home. The next morning, the hearing began, exactly the way I told you it began, with the court officer calling my name before I'd even set my coffee down. I want to tell you about one more witness before the hearing, because Faye insisted on it, and I understood why only after I saw the man's face in her office that final week. His name was Otis Pruitt. He'd worked the docks alongside me for close to 30 years, starting as a teenager hauling nets, ending up running his own small charter operation 2 slips down from mine. Faye had tracked him down because he'd been present, by pure chance, the day Bryce first mentioned simplifying things to a group of men at the Marina bait shop, months before he ever said it to my face at the funeral. Otis sat across from Faye's desk, cap in his hands, clearly uncomfortable being anywhere near a courtroom matter. "I don't want trouble with family," he told her plainly, "but Harlan's the straightest man on that whole stretch of water. Always has been. If somebody's saying he's lost his mind, they're lying. And I'll say so to anybody who asks." Faye asked him to write down, in his own words, exactly what he remembered hearing Bryce say that day at the bait shop. Otis wrote 3 sentences, plain and unpolished, the kind of statement that reads truer for having no polish at all. Bryce had said, word for word as Otis remembered it. The old man's slowing down. Once that happens, things get easier for everybody. 6 months before the funeral, 9 months before the first doctor, a full year before the petition. I read that statement in Faye's office, sitting across from her, and I felt something shift in my understanding of the whole timeline. This hadn't started with a doctor or a rumour. It had started, plainly, in Bryce's own head. Long before Corinne even died, the calculation already running quietly under the surface of every kind word he'd ever said to me at a family dinner. Faye didn't need Otis to testify in person. His written statement, notarized, sat behind a 5th tab in a folder that already had more than enough to do its work. But I asked her to keep him on the list anyway, in case the hearing ran longer than expected, in case Bryce's attorney tried some new angle nobody had anticipated. She agreed, the way she agreed to most things I asked, without argument, because 30 years of practice had taught her that a client who thinks like a mechanic, who wants a backup part ready, even when the primary one looks solid, is usually a client worth trusting on instinct. I drove home from that meeting thinking about the year that stretched out ahead, still not knowing exactly how it would end, only knowing, with the particular calm of a man who has checked every seam twice, that whatever came next, the ground under me would hold. I want to add one more piece before I take you back into that courtroom. I skipped past something that happened the night before the hearing. It matters more than almost anything else I've told you. Milo called me that evening, on his own, using Renee's old cell phone she'd handed down to him for emergencies. I almost didn't recognise the number. I nearly let it go to voicemail before something told me to pick up. "Grandpa," he said, quiet, careful, the way kids sound when they've been listening at doors they weren't supposed to be listening at. "I heard Mum and Dad fighting tonight. Dad said something about money. He said a number. I wrote it down because I didn't understand it, and I wanted to ask you." He read me the number off a scrap of paper in his careful handwriting. $380,000, the exact figure Chester Voss had given me weeks earlier. The loan and the unpaid supplier lien, combined, apparently said out loud in Bryce's own kitchen, in front of a 12-year-old, in a fight that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the debt Bryce had been hiding from everyone, including, it seemed, from Renee for far longer than she'd let on. "Grandpa, is Dad in trouble?" Milo asked. I chose my words carefully. The way you choose words for a boy that age. "Honest, but not cruel. Your dad's made some decisions with money that didn't work out the way he hoped," I said. "That happens to people sometimes, son. It doesn't make him a monster. It makes him scared. And scared people sometimes do things that hurt other people, without meaning the hurt personally. Tomorrow, some of that's going to come out in a courtroom. I need you to know, whatever you hear, none of it is your fault, and none of it changes how much your grandmother and I have always loved you. He was quite a long moment on the line. Then he said, "I still want to learn the injector trick faster. Can we practice this weekend? After everything?" I told him, "Absolutely, son. First thing Saturday morning." I meant it with my whole chest. In the middle of everything that had happened that year, a boy asking to keep learning a trade from his grandfather was the clearest sign I had. Whatever else got broken in my family, that particular thread was going to hold. I didn't sleep much after that call. Not from worry, from something closer to readiness. The kind of alert calm I used to feel the night before a big repair job on a boat that absolutely had to sail the next morning, regardless of what shape the engine was actually in. I got up twice in the night, not to pace, just to check once more that the steel toolbox in the workshop was exactly where it belonged, that the letter and the ledgers and the trust copy were all still there, waiting, the way they'd been waiting patiently for 2 years, for a morning exactly like the one now, only a few hours away. I thought, lying there in the dark, about something Corinne used to say whenever a big storm was rolling in off the Sound, and I'd be out checking lines at the marina until well past midnight. She'd stand on the porch and call out, "Not worried exactly, just practical, Harlan, you've done everything you can do. The rest is just weather now." I said that to myself, alone in that bed, at nearly 3 in the morning, the night before the hearing. I've done everything I can do. The rest is just weather now. I finally drifted off somewhere past 3. The alarm never even got the chance to go off. I woke on my own, the way I always do, right at the edge of first light. The morning of the hearing, I woke before my alarm, the way I have most mornings for 41 years. Body still running on trawler time, even though I haven't captained anything but my own tide yard in a decade. I made coffee. I fed the 2 barn cats that showed up one winter and never left. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at Corinne's roses. Still not blooming. Still green. Still patient. I said good morning to them the way I do most days. Talking to a rosebush cost a man nothing, and Corinne always said plants listen better than most people. I put on the good grey suit. I'd worn it to exactly 3 occasions in the last decade. Milo's christening, Corinne's funeral. And now this. I drove myself. I didn't ask Faye to pick me up. A man walking into a courtroom under his own power sends a message before he ever opens his mouth. I wanted that message sent plainly. Faye Odom was waiting for me on the courthouse steps on Pamlico Street, 2 blocks from the marina where I'd kept my first boat 40 years ago. She had a single leather folio under her arm. Thin, unremarkable, the kind of folio you'd walk right past if you didn't know what was inside it. She squeezed my arm once and said, "You ready?" "I've been ready since October," I said, and we went in together. The courtroom was smaller than people expect, wood-panelled, a little worn at the edges. The kind of room where 100 years of small-town business has been settled quietly by people who mostly wanted to get home for supper. Renee was already there, sitting beside Bryce at the petitioner's table, in a navy dress I recognised from her mother's funeral. She didn't look at me when I came in. Bryce did. He gave me a small nod, almost friendly. The nod of a man who genuinely believed he'd already won. Milo wasn't there. Faye had insisted on that beforehand. Gently, telling Renee a courtroom was no place for a 12-year-old regardless of how it went. For once, Bryce and I agreed on something. I didn't want my grandson watching either version of what was about to happen. The judge was a woman named Constance Reyes, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up into grey hair, a reputation around the county for being unhurried and exact. The kind of judge who reads every page of a filing before she asks a single question. I liked her before she said a word. A woman who reads everything is a woman who eventually finds everything. I had built my entire defence on the assumption that eventually somebody would read everything. Bryce's attorney opened. A younger man, sharp suit, sharper hurry. The kind of lawyer who talks fast because he's paid by the hour, and slow talk costs his client money they didn't have. He laid out the petition. Documented cognitive decline, 2 independent medical evaluations, a pattern of confusion reported by close family observers, concern for the safety and financial security of an elderly man living alone since the death of his wife 3 years prior. He used the word vulnerable 4 times in 6 minutes. I counted. Old habit. Then Bryce took the stand. I want to tell you honestly, I felt something. Watching my son-in-law raise his right hand and swear to tell the truth, in a room where I already knew, to the dollar, how far from the truth he was about to travel. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to the feeling of watching a bad weld about to fail. You've told the man twice already it wouldn't hold. Now he's about to find out for himself, in front of everybody, exactly why you said so. Bryce testified that I'd forgotten my own address twice in the past year. That never happened. He testified that Renee had found me standing in the garden at 2 a.m. once, calling for Corinne, disoriented. That also never happened. Though I did, once, go out to check the roses after a hard frost warning, at a reasonable hour, worried the cold snap might kill the climbing rose Corinne had babied for 2 years, somewhere between what actually happened and what got repeated at that pharmacy, at that church, in that petition. The story had grown teeth it never had at the source. He testified that I'd become erratic about money, mentioning, without ever naming a figure, that I'd made unusual financial decisions the family didn't understand. He never once said the word trust. He never once said the word deed, because he still, at that moment, sitting under oath in that wood-panelled room, had no idea what those unusual decisions actually were. The judge asked him directly, "Mr. Duval, what specifically do you believe your father-in-law is no longer capable of managing?" Bryce hesitated, just slightly, the hesitation of a man reciting a script he'd rehearsed for the easy questions, but not for the direct ones. His estate, he said. The property. The accounts. He's 72 years old and living alone, and frankly, Your Honour, we're worried he doesn't fully understand what he still owns or what it's worth. I almost smiled at that. Almost. I didn't. A man doesn't smile at his own son-in-law's undoing, even when the undoing's entirely of his own making. I sat still. I let it land in the room the way Faye and I had planned it would. Renee testified next. This was harder to watch. I could see, even from where I sat, that some of what she said she no longer fully believed saying. She repeated the story about the garden at 2 a.m, softer this time, less certain. She repeated a version of the story I'd told twice that turned out to be 2 different stories, about 2 different repairs, the one from back in the spring. When the judge asked her to specify what exactly I'd said that seemed confused, Renee paused a long moment and said, "I don't remember the exact words anymore, Your Honour." It felt confusing at the time. Not it was confusing. It felt confusing. Faye wrote something down on her legal pad the moment Renee said it. I understood exactly what she'd written. I'd been waiting a year to hear my daughter say something close to true in that room. The petitioners rested. Judge Reyes looked toward our table. "Mr. Odom," she said, catching herself. "Ms. Odom, do you have a response?" Faye stood. She didn't rush. That's one of the things I've always respected about her. 30 years of practicing law, 2 blocks from that courthouse, and she has never once talked like a woman in a hurry, even when she is one. "Your Honour," she said, "before I call any witnesses, I'd like to enter 3 items into evidence, if the court will permit. And then I have one very short question for Mr. Duval, on cross." The judge nodded. Faye opened the thin leather folio. I watched Bryce's face, for the first time all morning, show something other than confidence. He didn't know what was in that folio. Nobody at his table knew. Renee glanced at it too. Something in her posture changed, the way a person's posture changes when they sense, before they can name it, that the ground under a conversation just shifted. I sat quietly, hands folded on the table in front of me. The same hands that could still find an injector seat blind in under 3 minutes. The same hands that had signed a trust document 2 years earlier, with Doc Ellery watching, to make sure nobody could ever say later that my mind wasn't sound the day I did it. I looked once briefly at my daughter, not with anger, with something closer to sorrow for what she was about to learn, about the man she'd married. Then I looked at Faye Odom. I gave her the nod, the same nod I'd given her 100 times before in her office, going over the plan, checking each page, making sure everything was ready for exactly this moment. The clerk cleared his throat. A small, dry sound in that quiet room. He reached for a pen the way a man reaches for a wrench he already knows will fit. Somewhere behind me, a radiator ticked once, settling. The only other sound in the whole courtroom besides Faye's footsteps crossing the worn floor. I thought, watching her cross that short distance, about how long 2 years can feel, and how short it can feel too, depending entirely on which end of the waiting you're standing on. I had been on the patient end for 2 years. Bryce was about to find out what it felt like to be on the other one, all at once, in under 9 minutes. She stepped toward the clerk's desk. Faye set the folio down flat on the table for a moment before she opened it. The way a man sets down a level before he trusts a reading, making sure the surface underneath is square first. Nobody in that courtroom moved. Bryce's attorney had gone very still beside his client. The particular stillness of a lawyer who senses, before he can name why, that the next few minutes are not going to go the way his morning had been going so far. I've spent 41 years around machines that fail slow and then fail all at once. A bearing that hums a little louder every week for a year before the day it finally seizes. That's what the next 9 minutes felt like from where I sat. Slow, then all at once. Judge Reyes leaned forward slightly in her chair, reading glasses still pushed up in her grey hair. Waiting. Your Honour, Faye said. Exhibit 1. The Corin Speck Family Trust, executed and notarised 2 years ago, this past January. It transfers the Tideyard property, the family residence, and the bulk of Mr. Speck's liquid savings into an irrevocable trust for the benefits of his grandson, Milo Duval, with Mr. Speck retaining lifetime income rights and full operational control. I direct the court's attention to the witness signature on the final page. She handed the folder to the clerk, who handed it up to Judge Reyes. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the old radiator against the far wall ticking through its cycle, a sound I'd have missed on any other day. The witness signature, Faye continued, belongs to Dr. Raymond Ellery, who has served as Mr. Speck's primary physician for over 20 years. He was present specifically to attest, at the time of signing, that Mr. Speck was of sound mind and fully understood the nature and consequence of the document he was executing. Dr. Ellery has provided a sworn statement, included behind tab 2, confirming that assessment. He also confirms he has seen no cognitive change in Mr. Speck in the 2 years since. Judge Reyes read the trust document's opening page, then flipped, unhurried, to the signature page. She read the date twice. I watched her read it twice. Faye had told me she would. A careful judge always double-checks a date that matters this much. This document is dated, Judge Reyes said, 2 years before the petition currently before this court. Yes, Your Honour, Faye said. 2 years before Mr. Duval's petition alleges cognitive decline began. Bryce's attorney stood, started to object to something, wasn't entirely sure what to object to, and sat back down when the judge raised one hand without even looking at him. Exhibit 2, Faye said, a written statement from Dr. Ellery, dated last month. It describes an unsolicited call he received from his own office staff, reporting that Mr. Duval, or someone speaking on his behalf, had told multiple people in this community that Mr. Speck suffered a stroke. Dr. Ellery states clearly, and is prepared to testify in person if the court requires it, that Mr. Speck has never had a stroke, has shown no signs of one, and that this rumour appears to have been fabricated and circulated deliberately. Renee's head turned toward Bryce at that. Just slightly, just enough that I saw it. I think Judge Reyes saw it too. She paused a beat longer than the moment strictly required before moving on. Exhibit 3, Faye said. Here her voice, for the first time all morning, picked up the smallest edge. Not anger. Precision. The complete appointment record from the office of Dr. Simeon Okafor, the travelling physician, whose August evaluation forms the primary basis for this petition. This record, obtained by subpoena, shows Mr. Speck had exactly one appointment with Dr. Okafor. 11 minutes, no follow-up ever scheduled. The petition, however, describes this as part of, and I'm reading directly, Your Honour, quote, an ongoing course of cognitive assessment, end quote. There was no ongoing course. There was one 11-minute visit. She let that sit a moment before continuing. The court should also be aware, and I have a letter from the State Medical Board confirming this, that Dr. Okafor is currently under a separate, formal inquiry. Similarly, brief evaluations, performed on at least 3 other elderly patients across 2 counties. Evaluations that were subsequently used, in each case, to support guardianship or power of attorney petitions filed by family members. That landed harder than anything else that morning. I watched it land on Judge Reyes's face. A flicker of something that looked like the particular anger a careful person feels when they realise a pattern has been running under their courtroom for longer than one case. Finally, Faye said, I'd like to ask Mr. Duval one question on cross, if the court permits. Judge Reyes nodded. Bryce's attorney leaned over and murmured something to his client that didn't appear to calm him at all. Faye turned to Bryce, still on the stand, and asked, plainly, without theatre, "Mr. Duval, is it true that Duval Marine Sales currently owes approximately $320,000 on a loan secured to purchase 3 vessels, 2 of which remain unsold, and that this loan is due in full within the next 3 weeks?" Bryce's attorney objected. Relevance. Judge Reyes considered it a moment, then overruled. "I'd like to hear the answer," she said. "It may be entirely relevant to this court's understanding of motive." Bryce sat very still. The whole courtroom sat very still. I sat still too. I'd known this answer for months. Isaac Cabrati. I'd known it since a Saturday morning, walking the marina with coffee in hand, seeing a repo notice zip-tied to a trailer hitch. "That's approximately correct," Bryce said finally. "And is it also true," Faye continued, "that 3 weeks ago you contacted First Coastal Bank about a bridge loan, offering, in your words to the loan officer, quote, anticipated inheritance from my father-in-law's estate, end quote, as collateral, despite the fact that no such inheritance has vested and that the property in question has, in fact, been held in an irrevocable trust naming your own son as beneficiary for the past 2 years?" Bryce didn't answer right away. Renee turned fully now, staring at her husband. I watched in real time 20 years of a marriage's worth of trust, doing something I can only describe as buckling. The way a beam buckles under a load it was never rated to carry. Slow at first, then all at once. "I wasn't aware of the trust," Bryce said. Quiet. "No," Faye said. "You weren't." "That's precisely the point, Mr. Duval." Judge Reyes removed her reading glasses, set them on the bench. She looked out over the courtroom for a long moment before she spoke. When she did, her voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had, in fact, read everything and had reached the end of reading it. "I've heard enough," she said. "This petition alleges cognitive decline, supported by evaluations that do not withstand basic scrutiny, filed by a petitioner who, by his own admission moments ago, sought to leverage assets he did not understand he had no claim to, assets that were legally and irrevocably protected 2 full years before this action was filed, witnessed at signing by the respondent's own longtime physician, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of challenge." She looked directly at Bryce. "Mr. Duval, I am dismissing this petition in full. I am also referring the matter of Dr. Okafor's evaluations to the State Medical Board, which I understand already has an open inquiry, and I want that connected formally to this case. And I will say, for the record, that filing a guardianship petition against a competent adult, supported by evidence this thin, is not a matter this court takes lightly, regardless of the family relationship involved." The gavel came down once. Not loud. It didn't need to be loud. I'd waited a year to hear a sound smaller than that gavel land with that much weight. I didn't smile. I didn't look at Bryce. I looked instead at my daughter, sitting very still beside a man whose whole plan had just come apart in front of her, in under 9 minutes. I saw for the first time in a year something in her face that looked less like certainty and more like a woman finally seeing the ground she'd been standing on for exactly what it was. Faye closed the folio. She didn't gloat either. That's not how either of us was built to do this. She gathered the 3 exhibits, straightened them into a neat stack, and sat back down beside me at the table. Under her breath, "Just for me," she said. 2 years old. Airtight. "Told you." "You did," I said. We sat there another minute while the courtroom cleared. Bryce's attorney spoke to him in a low, fast voice near the door. Renee sat frozen in her chair, not moving, not looking at her husband, not looking at me either, just staring at the space on the table where the folio had been. I stood up eventually. I straightened my jacket, the same grey suit from Milo's christening and Corinne's funeral. I walked past my daughter's table, slow, unhurried, the way I've walked past every hard thing in my life. I said one sentence to her, quiet, the only thing I said to either of them that whole morning. "Your mother saw this coming 2 years before I let myself believe it. I think it's time you and I had a longer conversation than the one we're going to have today." Then I walked out of that courtroom into the March sunlight on Pamlico Street, past the marina, past the boat I no longer captained. For the first time in a year, I felt the particular kind of quiet that comes after a load finally gets set down. Not victory exactly, just weight finally, off the shoulders that had been carrying it. I drove home from the courthouse alone. The way I'd driven there, past the marina, past the tide yard, past Corinne's roses still holding their green patience against a March that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be spring. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for a few minutes before going inside, not because I needed to compose myself. I already felt about as composed as I've felt in 3 years, but because I wanted a minute alone before the phone started ringing. And I knew it would. Faye called first within the hour to walk me through what happened after I left. The State Medical Board's inquiry into Dr. Simeon Okafor was already open before my hearing. It expanded within days to a formal suspension of his ability to conduct competency evaluations, pending full review. Once Judge Reyes's referral landed on the board's desk alongside my case file, Faye told me 2 other families had already reached out to her office by the end of that same week, both with pending guardianship matters built on Okafor's evaluations. They'd heard through the county grapevine what happened in my courtroom. One of them, an elderly widow in the next county over, had a stepson trying the identical playbook. She dropped the petition against her entirely within 10 days, rather than face the same kind of scrutiny in open court. I want to sit with that a moment. It mattered to me as much as anything that happened in my own case. My fight had never really been just about the tide yard, or the house, or the $600,000 Corinne and I had carefully saved over 4 decades. It had become, without my planning it that way, a small crack in a much bigger wrong, one that had apparently been running quietly through 3 counties for longer than anybody realised, preying on people who didn't happen to have a lawyer who'd kept a decade-long file open, people without a doctor willing to testify under oath, people without a dead wife who'd written a letter from the far side of her own grave. I thought about all the families who hadn't had that particular luck. I was glad, plainly glad, that whatever else came of that morning, at least one other guardianship case had already quietly folded because of it. Duval Marine sales collapsed faster than even I expected. The banknote, $320,000, came due 19 days after the hearing, exactly as Faye had calculated. Bryce had no bridge loan to cover it, no anticipated inheritance to leverage, nothing but a hand-lettered for sale sign that had drawn 0 calls in 3 weeks. The bank foreclosed on the commercial property within 6 weeks of the hearing. The second lien holder, the part supplier owed $60,000, filed suit separately and won a judgment against Bryce personally, since the business itself no longer had assets worth attaching. By early summer, Bryce Duval no longer owned a business or a building. A man who had stood in a courtroom and called himself worried about my ability to understand what I owned. Within a few more months, he didn't own a marriage either. Renee moved out in April, taking Milo with her, into a small rental 2 streets over from the house she and Bryce had shared for 9 years. She didn't ask me for money. I want that understood plainly. It would have been easy for people to assume, watching from outside, that a daughter caught in a financial collapse would come straight to her father's door with her hand out. She didn't. She got a job at the county clerk's office, the same building where the trust had been recorded 2 years earlier without her knowledge, filing papers for other families' small, quiet dramas while she sorted through her own. I respected that more than almost anything else she did that whole year. She came to see me on her own, about 3 weeks after she moved out, sitting at my kitchen table again, the same table where she'd cried once already that year, admitting she'd believed Bryce without checking. This time she didn't cry right away. She sat a long while, quiet, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, before she finally spoke. "I read the letter," she said. "Faye showed it to me. Mum's letter. I hadn't planned on that. I hadn't asked Faye to show it to her. But I understood hearing it, why Faye had made that choice on her own. Some things a lawyer knows to do without being told. The same way I know when an engine needs a part before the owners even notice the sound is wrong. She saw it coming 2 years before I let myself see it," Renee said. 2 years, Dad. She wrote to you about Bryce 2 years before any of this happened. I spent the whole time defending him instead of asking a single hard question. "You loved him," I said. "That's not a crime, Renee. Loving somebody who turns out to be lying to you isn't the same thing as being complicit in the lie." "I told a judge you were confused," she said. Here the tears finally came. Quiet. The kind that had clearly been waiting a long time to be let out. I sat in that courtroom and I said things about my own father that weren't true, because I believed a man who was too scared and too proud to just tell me the truth about his own debts. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Same as I had at the diner back in January. You said something true too, I told her. You said it felt confusing at the time. That was the truest thing said in that whole courtroom, Renee. I heard it, so did the judge. We sat a long while after that, not saying much else, just sitting the way a father and daughter sit when the worst of something has finally passed and what's left is the slower work of finding a way back toward each other. I didn't offer forgiveness that day, not fully, not the easy kind people expect from a story like this one. I told her that trust, real trust, the kind her mother and I built over 43 years, doesn't come back all at once just because the facts finally lined up. I told her I loved her completely and unconditionally, the way I always had, that loving her didn't mean I was going to pretend the last year hadn't happened. I told her the door was open, and it would stay open, but she was going to have to keep walking through it, a little at a time. The same slow way trust gets rebuilt in anything, an engine, a marriage, a family. She said she understood. I believed her, mostly because of what she did next, which mattered more to me than any apology could have. She asked if Milo could keep coming to the tide yard on weekends, to keep learning the trade, to keep practicing the injector trick, to keep being, in her words, around the parts of this family that are actually solid. I told her that boy was welcome at my shop any day of the week for the rest of his life. And hers too, whenever she was ready to walk back through that particular door, herself. Milo, for his part, showed up that very Saturday, same as I'd promised him the night before the hearing. We sat on the 2 overturned buckets by the second dock. He pulled that injector pump apart and put it back together in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Faster than either of us had ever managed it. He looked up at me afterward with an expression that was pure, uncomplicated pride, the kind that hadn't existed on his face in months. "Grandpa," he said, "Mum said Grandma wrote you a letter. Can I read it someday?" "Someday," I told him, "when you're old enough to understand everything in it. I think your grandmother would have wanted that. I think she'd have wanted you to know exactly what kind of woman built half of everything you're going to inherit someday. Ledgers and roses and all." He nodded, satisfied with that answer, the way kids that age are satisfied with a promise made plainly and meant completely. He went back to the engine. I stood in the doorway of my own workshop, watching him work, feeling something in my chest that had been tight for the better part of a year finally start to loosen. I want to tell you one more thing about that first week after the hearing, because it's the piece that made the whole ordeal feel, finally, like it had actually ended rather than just paused. Doc Ellery called me on the Friday, 4 days after the ruling, sounding lighter than I'd heard him in months. The state medical board had moved with unusual speed once Judge Reyes's referral landed, and word had come back that Dr. Okafor had voluntarily surrendered his ability to perform any further competency evaluations, pending the outcome of the full inquiry, rather than fight the suspension and risk a public hearing of his own. Doc Ellery said it plainly. Whatever else happens to that man, Harlan, he won't be doing this to anybody else's father for a good while. Maybe ever. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. I thought about the widow in the next county, the one whose stepson had dropped his petition within 10 days of hearing what happened in my courtroom. I thought about however many other families, ones I'd never meet, ones whose names I'd never know, who might now go a little longer, or forever, without a stranger deciding their competence in 11 rushed minutes for $400. That felt like a bigger win than the tide yard, honestly. The tide yard was always going to be mine. This other thing, the crack in a wider wrong, that was something I hadn't set out to do and ended up doing anyway. The way the best work sometimes happens sideways, as a consequence of doing the right thing carefully, rather than as the goal itself. Chester Voss stopped by the shop that same week. Not on business, just to shake my hand and tell me he was glad it had gone the way it went. Small-town men don't always say much more than that, and they don't need to. A handshake at a workbench, a nod, glad that's settled. Harlan, and both of you understand exactly how much weight sat behind those few words. The Menharden Creek gossip mill, the same one that had spent the better part of a year quietly repeating Renee's careful language about good days and bad days, turned itself around within a month, the way small towns do, correcting course once the truth got loose in the open air. Pearl at the diner told me, the next time I came in for eggs, that she'd heard the whole ugly business from 3 different directions, and was glad the judge had seen right through it. I told her I appreciated that, and she refilled my coffee without charging me for it, which in a town like ours is its own small verdict. delivered in the only currency that actually matters at a diner counter. Otis Pruitt came by the shop that same week too, the man who'd given Faye the written statement about Bryce's comment at the bait shop, months before any of this became official. He never had to testify. His notarized page stayed in the folder, unused. One of those spare parts you keep on the shelf and never need, but sleep better knowing it's there. He shook my hand at the workbench, the same handshake Chester Voss had given me. "Wasn't going to let a lie about you stand, Harlan," he said. "Wasn't right." I told him I owed him for that. He waved it off, the way men on that stretch of water wave off most debts of decency. Like the idea of owing somebody for telling the truth was itself a strange notion to entertain. I want to tell you about Milo's school project one more time. There's a coda to it I didn't know about until months later. His teacher had kept a copy of his interview, the one where he wrote down, verbatim, what I'd told him about the whole inheritance being about building something real with your own two hands. The following spring, the school held a small ceremony for outstanding student work. Milo's project was one of 6 chosen from the whole 7th grade to be read aloud at the assembly. Renee went. She told me about it afterward, sitting at my kitchen table, with something like wonder in her voice. She'd sat in that auditorium and heard her own son read my words back to a room full of strangers. Somewhere in the middle of it, she'd started crying, quietly. Not from sadness this time, from something closer to pride. Watching her boy carry forward exactly the kind of steadiness she'd nearly let a bad marriage talk her out of trusting. I framed a copy of that project. It hangs in the workshop now, next to a photograph of Corinne, standing in front of the very first slip we ever leased, squinting into the sun, 26 years old and certain of absolutely nothing, except that she loved the man standing beside the camera. Milo's careful handwriting sits under glass a few feet from her face. Some mornings I catch myself looking at both of them at once. The woman who built half of everything, and the boy who's going to carry the rest of it forward. I think that's about as close to a complete inheritance as any man gets to leave behind. Renee and I settled into something steadier as that first year after the hearing wore on. She came by most Sundays, sometimes with Milo, sometimes alone. We didn't always talk about the hard year. Mostly we talked about ordinary things. A leaking faucet at her rental, a raise she'd earned at the clerk's office, a man from her church choir who'd asked her to dinner, and whether she was even ready to say yes. I told her there was no clock on that kind of readiness. That grief and betrayal both take exactly as long as they take. That I trusted her to know her own timing better than anybody else could tell her. She asked me once, near the 1-year mark, whether I still thought about forgiving Bryce. I told her the honest truth. I didn't hate him. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend on the roses and the tide yard and my grandson. But I didn't forgive him either. Not yet. Maybe not ever, in the way she meant it. What I felt mostly was the particular tiredness of a man who'd had to defend something that should never have needed defending, and a quiet gratitude that the defending was finally over. I hope he gets himself right, I told her. For Milo's sake and honestly for his own. But hoping a man gets right and trusting him with anything of mine again are two very different things. I don't believe in confusing them. She said she understood that better than anyone. I should tell you what happened to the rest of it. A story like this one isn't honest if it only shows you the parts that feel good. Bryce moved in with his own parents that summer. Back into the bedroom he'd grown up in. A grown man in his late 30s sleeping under the same roof he'd left at 18. The irony of that wasn't lost on anyone in Menharden Creek who'd followed the story, which by August was most of the town. A man who'd spent a year insisting I was too old and too confused to keep my own house, ending up unable to keep his own. Truth be told, I took no pleasure in that particular detail. I'd built my whole life around the idea that a man's dignity is worth protecting. Mine, and eventually, once he was ready to earn it back, even his. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The math had done all the talking that needed doing. The divorce finalised quietly without much drama in the fall. Renee kept the small rental, kept her job at the clerk's office, kept full custody of Milo, with a visitation arrangement Bryce mostly honoured, to his credit, once the dust settled, and he'd had time to sit with what his choices had actually cost him. I heard, second hand, that he'd started seeing a counsellor, on his own, without anyone pushing him to, that he'd told someone at that yacht club bar, where he used to buy rounds he could no longer afford, that the worst part of the whole year wasn't losing the business. It was watching his own son learn to distrust him. I don't know if that's true. I wasn't there. I'll tell you honestly that some part of me hopes it is, not for Bryce's sake particularly, for Milo's. A boy deserves eventually a father who's done the hard work of becoming someone worth trusting again, even if that work takes years, even if it happens slowly, at a distance, earned back one small decision at a time. As for me, I want to tell you about the summer that followed. It was, without question, the best summer I'd had since Corinne passed. The tide yard ran the way it always had. Steady, honest work. Boats in and out. The compressor humming its familiar complaint every morning until it warmed up properly. I paid off the last small note on a piece of equipment I'd financed years back. $42,000. The final debt of any kind attached to my name. I stood in that empty workshop one evening in June, feeling something close to what I imagine a man feels, crossing a finish line he'd stopped expecting to reach. The roses bloomed in May, the way they always eventually do, hydrangeas heavy and blue against the fence line. The climbing rose Corinne had babied for 2 years, finally covering half the trellis in a way I don't think even she quite pictured when she planted it. I sat out there most evenings that summer with a glass of tea, talking to her the way she'd told me to, among the things she'd actually built with her own hands. I told her more than once that the letter had done exactly what she'd hoped it would do. It had protected me. It had, in its own quiet way, protected Renee too, eventually, once she was ready to hear it. Milo spent most of that summer at the tide yard, officially my part-time apprentice now, a title I gave him half as a joke and half completely seriously. The boy had a gift for engines the same way his grandmother had a gift for numbers. I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure that gift doesn't go to waste. He can do the injector trick in under 2 minutes now. I've stopped timing him against my own record. He's faster than I ever was at his age. I tell him that plainly because false modesty helps nobody, and a boy deserves to know exactly how good he's getting. I want to close with something Faye Odom said to me, months after the hearing, over coffee at her office on Pamlico Street. We were going over some routine paperwork, nothing to do with Bryce or Renee, just the ordinary business of an old man keeping his affairs in order. She looked up from the file at one point and said, almost offhand, "You know, Harlan, in 30 years of practicing law, I've seen a lot of families tear themselves apart over money. That was never really the point. You're one of the only clients I've had who understood, the whole time, that the money was never the actual fight." She was right about that, though it took me most of a hard year to be able to say it plainly myself. The fight was never really about the tide yard, or the $2,400,000 Corinne and I built from a leased slip and a used compressor, or even the trust itself, careful as I'd been to build it. The fight was about being believed. About a man who'd spent 41 years being exactly who he said he was. Honest in his ledgers, steady in his word, sharp enough to run a business and raise a daughter and bury a wife with his dignity intact. Being told suddenly by people who'd married into his family that none of that counted anymore, that his own mind couldn't be trusted, that his own name on his own deed needed a stranger's permission to still mean something. I never threw a punch in this whole story. I want that understood plainly. I know some people expect a different kind of ending from a man who's been wronged the way I was wronged. I never raised my fist at anybody. Not Bryce. Not the doctor who took 11 minutes to decide I couldn't be trusted with my own life. Not anyone. The only weapons I ever used were the same ones I've used my whole working life. Patience. The kind that outlasts a bad season without panicking. Accuracy. The kind that keeps a ledger honest to the penny for 40 years. And the plain truth, laid out flat on a table where anyone could look at it. The way you'd lay out a set of tools before a job. Everything visible. Nothing hidden. Nothing needing an excuse. That's the whole of it, really. Not a story about revenge, though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. A story about a man who built something real, with his own 2 hands, who protected it the same careful way he'd built it, who refused quietly, without ever raising his voice, to let anyone convince him that 72 years of a sound mind and a hard life's work could simply be signed away because it was convenient for somebody else's debts. Corinne used to say the best repairs are the ones nobody notices, the ones that just quietly hold year after year without anybody thinking twice about what's keeping the whole structure standing. I think about that a lot these days, sitting on my porch in the evenings, watching Milo run the tide yard's evening checks the way I taught him, watching the roses hold their colour longer into the fall than they used to. Watching my daughter's headlights turn into my driveway most Sunday afternoons now, a little more often each month. The trust between us rebuilding itself the same slow, careful way you'd rebuild anything worth keeping. I am 73 years old now. A year older than I was the morning they told a judge I couldn't be trusted with my own life. I still get up before the sun. I still keep the ledgers honest to the penny. I still water the roses on a schedule that has nothing to do with what the roses actually need. Some promises you keep for the person who asked, not for the plant. And if anybody ever tries again to tell me I'm too old, too confused, too far past my own usefulness to know what's mine, I'll tell them exactly what I told a courtroom full of people who should have known better. I don't get loud, but I get accurate. And the truth laid out plain on a table has never once needed me to raise my voice to be believed.